My son said, "I found a buyer for your house. You're going to a nursing home." I picked up the pen and quietly signed. He hugged his wife. Finally! But when the buyers came to the meeting, my surprise was waiting for them. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Collins, and I was 74 years old when my son tried to sell the ground from under my feet. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened. I was not a frail woman. I was not confused or lonely or lost. I woke up every morning at 6:15, made a pot of dark coffee in the kitchen my late husband Harold had renovated with his own hands back in 1987, and I sat at the window that looks out onto the backyard maple, the one Harold planted the year our Daniel was born. I read the newspaper. I tended my garden from April through October. I baked on Sundays. I drove myself to the doctor, to the pharmacy, to the grocery store on Route 9, where I'd been shopping since 1979. I had lived in that house for 41 years. It was a white colonial on Birchwood Lane in Mill Haven, Connecticut. Nothing grand, nothing showy. 3 bedrooms, a wide front porch, hardwood floors. Harold refinished twice, the kind of house that breathes with you, that holds 40 years of Christmas mornings and summer dinners and late-night worries in its walls. My name was on the deed. Harold had made sure of that before he passed in 2019, quietly, in the master bedroom with his hand in mine. After Harold died, Daniel called more often. At first I was grateful. He lived 40 minutes away in Westport with his wife Sharon, a slim, precise woman with a talent for making you feel subtly wrong about everything you just said. They visited on holidays, sometimes on random Sundays. Sharon would walk through the rooms slowly, touching things. She'd admire the house in a way that made me uneasy even then, though I couldn't have told you why. "This place is too much for you to manage alone, Mom," Daniel said one evening in the spring of last year. We were sitting on the porch. He hadn't touched his lemonade. "I manage just fine," I told him. "The gutters need replacing. The furnace is old. The property taxes went up again." I looked at him. "Daniel, I paid my property taxes before you knew what taxes were." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That was the first signal. I filed it away the way you do when you don't want to believe something. The second came 3 weeks later, when I overheard Sharon on the phone in my kitchen. She'd come by to drop off some dish she'd made, something with quinoa I never asked for. She didn't know I'd come in through the back door. "The square footage alone," she was saying. "And the lot. Richard says it's worth at least $680, maybe $7 if they stage it properly." She stopped when she saw me. Her face rearranged itself into a smile so fast it was almost impressive. "Just talking to my sister," she said, setting the phone face down on the counter. "About her house hunt." I smiled back. "How nice," I said. But I thought about the number she'd said. $680,000. I thought about it that night, lying in Harold's side of the bed, listening to the maple tree move in the wind outside. The third signal came in June. Daniel arrived on a Tuesday, unannounced, which was unusual. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, and he had what I can only describe as a prepared face. The face of a man who has rehearsed something. "Mom," he said, "I've been doing a lot of thinking about your situation, about what's best for you." My situation, as though I were a problem to be solved. "I've found a very good facility," he continued, "in Fairfield. It's beautiful. Really, it's more like a resort. They have activities, medical staff on site, a dining room, a nursing home," I said. A senior living community, he corrected. Daniel, I am not going to a nursing home. He leaned forward. And I've found a buyer for the house, a serious buyer. Young family, pre-approved. They're ready to move fast. I looked at him across the table. This man I had raised, whose scraped knees I had cleaned, and whose nightmares I had sat beside. And I felt something cold move through me. Not just fear. Something harder than fear. The paperwork is just preliminary, he said, sliding a folder across the table. Just to show the buyer there's intent. It's not binding. Was it not binding? Was I truly sitting in Harold's kitchen being asked to sign away Harold's house? I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. I have always had steady hands. And I signed. Daniel exhaled, a long, slow breath of relief he tried to hide. He reached across and squeezed my hand. Then he stood and called into the hallway. Sharon had been waiting just around the corner. She came in, bright-faced, and he pulled her into a hug right there in my kitchen, and she laughed, a small, delighted sound. Finally, that laugh said. Finally. I sat very still and watched them, and I thought, you have no idea what you just started. They left at 4:30. I heard Daniel's car back out of the driveway, heard the quiet that followed, and I sat at that kitchen table without moving for a long time. The folder was still in front of me. I am not a woman who cries easily. Harold used to say I had the composure of a federal judge, but that evening, alone in the house I had lived in for 4 decades, I pressed my hands flat against the table and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not crying. Something older than crying. A cold, sinking recognition. I had signed something. I didn't know exactly what. The pages had been full of language I hadn't read carefully. Letter of intent, preliminary agreement, good faith deposit. And I had signed because I was startled, because I was proud, because some stubborn part of me had thought, it means nothing. They'll never pull this off. But sitting there in the quiet, I understood that I had made a mistake. Not a fatal one. Not yet. But a mistake. I opened the folder. It was 4 pages. A letter of intent between a seller, listed as Margaret A. Collins, and a buyer listed as Hartwell Property Holdings, LLC. There was no individual name, just an LLC. The address was a P.O. box in Bridgeport. The purchase price listed was $595,000. I knew, without needing to be told, that the house was worth considerably more than that. Sharon had said $680 on the phone, maybe $7. I read the document twice more. Then I went to the kitchen drawer where I keep important papers, and I found Harold's copy of our original deed, our homeowner's insurance policy, and, near the back, a business card I hadn't looked at in over 3 years. Richard Hale, attorney at law. Estate planning and property law. Richard had handled Harold's estate. He was 71, semi-retired, and he owed me nothing. But we had known each other for 25 years, and he was a man I trusted the way you trust a good doctor, quietly and completely. I called him at 5 o'clock. He answered on the 3rd ring, and when I told him what had happened, calmly, in order, without embellishment, there was a silence on the other end of the line. "Read me the exact language of the document," he said. I did. "All right," he said when I finished. "Margaret, this is not a binding sales contract. A letter of intent in Connecticut property law is generally non-binding unless it contains specific language about consideration and acceptance. And what you've described doesn't meet that threshold. You haven't transferred anything. You haven't agreed to a price. You've expressed intent. That's all." I exhaled slowly. However, he continued, and I heard the weight of that word, if Daniel is working with an LLC buyer who is pressing for a quick close, and if he has, or believes he has, your cooperation, the situation can escalate. They could present a full purchase agreement. They could pressure you to sign under the same circumstances. And if that happens without proper legal guidance, I won't let that happen, I said. I know you won't. Can you come in Thursday morning? I can come tomorrow, I said. There was a pause, and then a small sound I recognized as Richard suppressing a smile. Tomorrow at 10, then. I hung up and sat in the kitchen as the light outside turned from gold to gray. I thought about Daniel's relieved exhale, about Sharon's laugh, about the P.O. box in Bridgeport, about an LLC with no human name attached to it. Something was wrong. Not just the opportunism of a son who had decided his mother's house was an asset to be liquidated. Something more organized than that. The LLC, the prepared folder, the language about good faith deposits. Daniel was not a sophisticated man. He worked in insurance sales. He was decent with numbers. But he was not the kind of man who set up shell companies. Someone had helped him with this, or was using him. I went to the living room and sat in Harold's armchair by the window, the one he'd read in every evening. And I thought carefully about what I knew and what I needed to find out. What I knew. Daniel wanted the house sold, and me moved out. Sharon had been calculating this for some time. A buyer was already arranged, not a young family, as Daniel had claimed, but a limited liability company. The price was below market value. What I needed to find out: who was Hartwell Property Holdings, LLC? What was Daniel's financial arrangement with them? And what exactly did he think he had gotten me to agree to? I had one advantage that Daniel had badly underestimated. I had time. I was not in a crisis. I was not ill, not incapacitated, not emotionally destroyed. I was a 74-year-old woman with a clear mind, a house I owned outright, and a very good attorney. I went upstairs, changed into my nightgown, and for the first time in months, I slept without waking once. The next morning, I was at Richard's office at 9:50, with the folder, the deed, and a yellow legal pad where I'd written down every detail I could remember about Sharon's phone call, Daniel's visit, and the letter of intent. Richard read through everything twice. He looked up over his reading glasses. You said Sharon mentioned a name on the phone, he said. Richard. She said Richard says it's worth at least $680. Yes? That's not me, he said. I know, I said. That's a real estate agent. Or an appraiser. Someone who's already assessed the property. He set down the folder. Margaret, this has been in planning for a while. Yes, I said. I believe it has. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me steadily. What do you want to do? I looked back at him with equal steadiness. I want to know exactly what they've done. And I want to make sure that when they bring those buyers to my house, everything that happens next is entirely on my terms. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, picked up his pen, and said, Then let's begin. Richard spent 2 hours with me that morning, and by the time I left his office on State Street, I had a clearer picture of my situation than I'd had in months. The letter of intent I had signed was, as he'd confirmed, non-binding under Connecticut law. But Richard explained the risk plainly. If Daniel presented me with a full purchase and sale agreement, the actual legal instrument for transferring property, and I signed it without understanding what I was doing, or signed it under conditions that could later be characterized as undue influence, the consequences could be severe. Not impossible to reverse, but costly, slow, and emotionally brutal. The most important thing right now, Richard said, is that we establish documentation of your capacity and your intent. I want you to sign a statement today, witnessed and notarized, affirming that you are the sole owner of the property at 14 Birchwood Lane, that you have not authorized any sale, and that any future transfer of that property will require your fully informed and voluntary consent, reviewed by counsel. I signed it before noon. Richard also made 2 phone calls while I sat in his office. The first was to a colleague in property law who confirmed that Hartwell Property Holdings, LLC, had been registered in Connecticut 8 months ago. 8 months. Long before Daniel had sat down at my kitchen table with his prepared face. The second call was to a licensed private investigator named Paulson, a compact, businesslike woman Richard had worked with before. She would look into Hartwell more thoroughly. I drove home along Route 9, past the grocery store, past the church where Harold and I had been married, past the elementary school Daniel had attended as a boy. I thought about how ordinary everything looked, how a town could hold a betrayal so quietly. When I arrived home, I found a voicemail from Daniel. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. Thought maybe we could do dinner this week, just the 3 of us. Sharon found this great Italian place in Westport you'd love. Give me a call." His voice was warm, easy. The voice of a man who believed everything was proceeding smoothly. I didn't call back. 3 days passed. I went about my routine carefully. Garden, coffee, newspaper, errands. But I was paying attention to everything differently now. When Daniel called again on Thursday and I didn't answer, there was a brief pause in the voicemail before he said, a little too lightly, "Just making sure everything's okay. Call me when you get a chance." He called again on Friday, and then, unexpectedly, Sharon called on Saturday morning. Margaret. She was bright and warm in the particular way she became bright and warm when she wanted something. "We haven't chatted in ages. How are you feeling? How's the garden?" I told her the garden was fine. I told her I was fine. I asked how her sister's house hunt was going, the one she'd supposedly been discussing on the phone the day I'd overheard her in my kitchen. There was a fractional pause. "Oh, she decided to wait a bit," Sharon said. "Such a busy market," I said pleasantly. After we hung up, I sat in Harold's chair and thought about that pause. They were beginning to feel something. Not certainty, not alarm, but the low-grade unease of people who expected an easy trajectory and are sensing, without knowing why, that the ground is slightly less stable than it was. Good. Paulson called me the following Tuesday. "Mrs. Collins," she said, "I have information I think you need to hear." I sat down at the kitchen table with my legal pad. Hartwell Property Holdings, LC, had been registered by 2 members. One was a man named Gary Fitch, a real estate developer with a record of acquiring undervalued properties, primarily from elderly owners, and flipping them at significant profit. He had been involved in 3 complaints to the Connecticut Department of Consumer Protection in the past 5 years. None had resulted in formal charges, but the pattern was documented. The second member of Hartwell Property Holdings, LLC, was my son, Daniel Arthur Collins. I wrote down the names. I underlined Daniel's twice, not because I needed to remember it, but because I needed to see it on paper. I needed it to be real. "There's more," Paulson said. "Mr. Collins stands to receive a 20% finder's fee upon successful close. Based on the purchase price listed in the letter of intent, that would be approximately $119,000, I said. I had done the arithmetic in my head before she finished the sentence. Paulson was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. I stared at my kitchen window. Outside, the maple tree moved. The one Harold had planted the year Daniel was born. $119,000. My son had attached a price tag to my home, to my life, to the 41 years Harold and I had built together. And the number was $119,000. I thought about his hand squeezing mine across the table. I thought about Sharon's laugh. Finally. "Mrs. Collins?" Paulson said carefully. "Are you all right?" "I'm quite all right," I said. My voice was level. "Please send me everything in writing. I'll have my attorney contact you directly." After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The afternoon light moved slowly across the floor. I was not angry, or rather, I was angry, but the anger had nowhere to go, so it went down, deep and still, into something more useful, something cold and patient and precise. I thought, they believe they have an old woman who has already been startled into signing a piece of paper. They believe she is isolated, manageable, sentimental. They believe the hard part is over. They have no idea what they have done. I picked up the phone and called Richard. "It's Margaret," I said. "I have the proof. Let's talk about what comes next." Richard and I spent 40 minutes on the phone that evening, and by the end of it, the shape of the plan was clear. It had 3 parts. The first was legal protection. Richard would file a formal notice with the Connecticut Property Records Office, a document that would flag any attempted transfer of 14 Birchwood Lane as requiring additional verification. It wouldn't prevent a sale, but it would slow one down and create a paper trail. He would also prepare a cease and desist letter directed at Hartwell Property Holdings, LLC, citing the involvement of a family member in a transaction involving a potentially vulnerable adult and the appearance of undue influence. The second part was the meeting itself. Daniel had said the buyers were ready to move fast. They would want to visit the house. To make the process feel normal, feel inevitable, before sliding a real contract under my nose. Richard and I agreed. I would not refuse that visit. I would schedule it. But I would control every condition of it. The third part was documentation. Every conversation with Daniel or Sharon from this point forward would be recorded. Connecticut is a one-party consent state, Richard confirmed. I could legally record any call in which I was a participant. I found Harold's old voice recorder in the study drawer and put fresh batteries in it that same night. The cease and desist letter went out on Friday. I know the exact moment Daniel received it because he called me at 11:42 in the morning. Not from his cell phone, but from his office number, which meant he was shaken enough to forget himself. "Mom." His voice was tight. "I just got something in the mail from a Richard Hale, calling himself your attorney." "He is my attorney," I said. I pressed the button on the recorder under my palm. "He's been my attorney for 25 years. What is this? A cease and desist?" "A legal document, yes." "Mom, we were trying to help you. This is... Do you understand how this looks? You hired a lawyer against your own son?" "I hired a lawyer to protect my own property," I said pleasantly. "Which is what a sensible person does." He was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Lower, more careful. "Sharon and I are coming over. Tonight." "You're welcome to visit," I said, "but I should let you know that I'm recording this call." Another silence. Then, "Jesus, Mom." They arrived at 7. I had made tea. I sat at the kitchen table and I placed the voice recorder on the counter. Not hidden, not announced, simply present. Sharon saw it immediately and said nothing. Daniel sat down and leaned forward with his hands on the table. "We need to talk about what's happening here." "We do," I agreed. This lawyer of yours, this letter, you're making everything complicated for no reason. The buyers are serious people. The offer is fair. The offer is $85,000 below market value, I said. And one of the buyers is you. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd heard in years. Sharon's expression didn't change, but her hands, folded in her lap, went very still. Daniel said, Who told you? It's a matter of public record, I said. LLC registrations are publicly searchable in Connecticut. Your name is on the filing. He looked at Sharon. She looked back at him. Some decision moved between them in that glance. Mom. Daniel's voice shifted, softer now, the way it went when he was trying a different approach. Look, I know how this looks, but I was trying to make sure the money went to the right place, to the family. Do you understand? If you sell to a stranger, those profits just disappear into some... The profits from selling my house, I said, would belong to me. And when you're in a facility, I will not be in a facility. He looked at me for a long time, and then slowly, he changed again. The soft voice hardened. Mom, I have spoken to an elder law attorney about this. If there's reason to believe a person is unable to manage their own affairs, if a family member can demonstrate that, a court can appoint a guardian who has legal authority over financial decisions, including property. The word guardian dropped onto the table between us like something heavy. I looked at my son. I thought about the 41 years I had lived in this house. I thought about Richard's voice saying, We've established documentation of your capacity. I thought about the notarized statement, signed and witnessed and filed 2 weeks ago. Daniel, I said quietly, if you attempt to file for guardianship over me, you will need to demonstrate to a Connecticut probate court that I am cognitively impaired. You will need medical evidence. You will face an attorney I have already retained, who has a notarized statement of my full legal capacity, signed by 2 witnesses. The court will appoint an independent evaluator. The process takes months. It is a matter of public record, and it will be reported to the Adult Protective Services Unit, which is already aware of this situation. He stared at me. I made a phone call, I said simply, last week. Was that a bluff? Partly. I had called the state's Elder Services line and asked general questions without filing a formal complaint. But Daniel didn't know what I had and hadn't done, and the rest of what I'd said was entirely true. Sharon put her hand on Daniel's arm. He stood up abruptly, pushing back his chair. This isn't over, he said. No, I agreed, it isn't. They left without finishing their tea. I sat in the kitchen alone for a while, letting the silence settle. My heart was beating harder than I would have liked, but my hands were steady. Always steady. The following morning, I drove to the lake park 3 miles away, where Harold and I used to walk on Sunday afternoons. I brought a thermos of coffee and sat on our bench for an hour and a half, watching the water. Then I drove to the library and read a novel for 2 hours. Then I went home, made soup from scratch, and watched a British mystery program until 10 o'clock. I gave myself 3 days of this. 3 days of coffee and the bench and cooking in long, slow evenings. 3 days to let my nervous system believe that I was safe. Because I was safe, I needed to remember that. And fear is most dangerous when it convinces you otherwise. On the 4th day, I called Richard. I'm ready, I said. Let's schedule the meeting. Richard and I agreed that we would give Daniel 1 week before scheduling the meeting, enough time for the pressure on his end to build, not enough for him to make new legal moves. In the meantime, we waited. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days after Daniel and Sharon had stormed out of my kitchen, my phone rang at 9 in the morning. It was Sharon, not Daniel, Sharon, which told me something already. When Daniel wanted to fight, he called himself. When he wanted to negotiate, he sent Sharon, Margaret. Her voice was warm in that careful way again, like a hand extended at arm's length. I've been thinking about our visit, and I feel terrible about how it went. I truly do. I don't think any of us said what we meant. I said exactly what I meant, I replied. A small pause. Then, I know. And I admire that about you. I always have. Another pause, slightly longer. Daniel has been talking, and he wants you to know that the arrangement with Hartwell, the finder's fee, all of that. He's willing to step away from it completely, remove his name, sign whatever you need him to sign. I was quiet, listening. He just wants things to be right between you, Sharon continued. And we've been thinking, what if we approached this differently? What if instead of selling to an outside buyer, we worked out a family arrangement? Daniel and I could purchase the house from you. At full market value, Margaret, we're not asking for any discount. And you could stay in it for as long as you want. We'd handle the maintenance, the taxes, the repairs. You'd have none of the burden and all of the security. She let that settle. It was, I had to admit, a more sophisticated offer than I'd expected. It was designed to appeal to exactly the right things: my attachment to the house, my desire to avoid conflict, my love for my son, beneath all the anger. And if I had been a different woman, a more frightened woman or a lonelier one, it might have worked. But I thought about what it would mean in practice. Daniel and Sharon as the legal owners of 14 Birchwood Lane, with me as a tenant in my own home, entirely dependent on their goodwill. No deed in my name, no equity, no rights that couldn't be quietly revoked once I was less useful, or once a more profitable buyer came along. Sharon might believe she was offering a kindness, but the kindness had a door, and the door had a lock, and they would hold the key. Sharon, I said, that's a generous description of what you're proposing. But what you're describing is a situation in which I give up legal ownership of my home in exchange for a promise of continued residence. You understand that such a promise has no enforceable standing unless it's formalized in a legally binding contract, which your attorney would draft, not mine. Silence. I'll think about it, I said. Thank you for calling. I set down the phone and sat for a moment in the quiet. Was I tempted? In the way that any person is tempted by the path of least resistance when they are tired. But the tiredness passed quickly, because I thought about Daniel's face when I'd told him his name was on the LLC filing. That brief, unguarded look of a man caught. And I knew that whatever was being offered now was offered because they were afraid, not because they were sorry. Fear is not remorse. I had raised Daniel. I knew the difference. That afternoon, I walked next door to see my neighbor, Dorothy Winslow. Dorothy was 78, sharp as a nail, and had lived on Birchwood Lane longer than I had. We had been friends for 30 years in the particular way of women who understand each other without needing to explain much. I knocked on her door at 2 o'clock, and she took one look at my face and said, "I'll put the kettle on." I told her everything. Dorothy listened without interrupting, a rare quality. And when I finished, she set down her cup and said, "I always thought that woman counted your square footage every time she walked in." The relief of being known, really known, by another person is one of the underrated gifts of a long friendship. I laughed, and it was the first real laugh I'd had in weeks. Dorothy didn't offer advice I hadn't asked for. She offered something more useful. She told me that her nephew was a retired judge in Hartford, and that if I ever needed a character witness for any proceedings, she would not only testify, she would make sure her nephew heard my story first. The following Sunday, I went to church, which I had been attending less regularly since Harold died. And after the service, I spoke for the first time about what was happening to Reverend Cass, who had known our family for decades. I did not want sympathy, and I told her so. I wanted community. She understood. By the end of that week, I was no longer alone in a way that felt dangerous. Dorothy knew. Reverend Cass knew. Richard knew. I had people. Not an army. Just a handful of steady, trustworthy people who knew the truth and who, if anything happened to me, would be able to say clearly she was of sound mind. She was not isolated, she told us herself. That matters more than people understand. Isolation is the condition that makes exploitation possible. I had removed that condition. I called Richard on Friday. "Schedule the meeting," I said. "Let's end this." I had told Richard to set the meeting for the following Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. Daniel called me Monday morning. "Mom, Sharon and I want to come by. Just us. No lawyers, no paperwork. I miss you. I miss you." 3 words that arrived carefully gift-wrapped, and I knew exactly what they contained. "You're welcome to come," I said. "Tuesday at 4. They arrived with flowers. Sunflowers, always my favorite, which told me Sharon had remembered, which meant the visit had been planned with more care than a simple drop-by warranted. I put the flowers in water and set them on the windowsill and made coffee, and we sat in the living room, and for a few minutes it was almost ordinary. Daniel looked tired. I noticed that genuinely. The shadows under his eyes, the slight slackness at his jaw. He was not sleeping well. I allowed myself to feel something about that, briefly, because I was his mother, and some things don't stop mattering simply because they should. Then he leaned forward and said, "Mom, I need you to hear me. Really hear me." I looked at him over my coffee cup and waited. I know I handled this wrong. I know the way I went about it was, I should have talked to you first. I should have told you about the arrangement with Gary. I know that. And I'm sorry. The apology was real enough in its delivery. I had no way to know how real it was inside him. "But here's what you don't understand," he continued, and here the tone shifted, so slightly that someone who hadn't known him for 48 years might have missed it. "This house is going to become a problem. The market is good now, better than it'll be in 2 years. If you wait, if you let this situation get complicated with lawyers and filings and—" "Daniel," I said quietly. He stopped. "You were apologizing?" He blinked. Yes, I know, but you'd gotten as far as acknowledging that you should have spoken to me first. And then you moved directly into explaining why I should do what you want anyway." Sharon, seated beside him on the sofa, shifted slightly. She put her hand on Daniel's knee. "Margaret," Sharon said, with the measured gentleness of someone who has prepared for this as a chess move, "I think what Daniel is trying to say is that we're still your family. Whatever mistakes were made, and family doesn't. We don't want to watch you fight this alone when we could be working together." "I'm not alone," I said. Sharon continued as if I hadn't spoken. "You've lived in this house for 41 years. That's extraordinary. And Harold would have wanted—" "Don't," I said. The word came out quiet and final, and it stopped her mid-sentence. I looked at her directly. "Harold does not belong in this conversation. Please don't use him." She had the grace to look briefly, genuinely uncomfortable. Daniel tried once more. His voice had gone low and careful in the way it did when he was running out of other tools. "Mom, I've talked to an attorney, and the thing is, the filing you had your lawyer do, the notice on the property record, that has legal implications for me, too. It reflects on my professional reputation. My name is tied up in all of this now in a way that—" "That is a consequence," I said, "of the choices you made." He stared at me. "I love you," I said. "That is also true. Both things exist at the same time. But I will not cancel the legal protections I have put in place. I will not withdraw from the meeting on Thursday, and I will not sign any document that transfers this property. Not because I'm being stubborn, Daniel, because I know exactly what you were trying to do. He stood up. You want to play it this way, he said. And this was the real Daniel now, the one that appeared when the performance wore thin. Fine, fine, Mom. But don't call me when the furnace goes. Don't call me when the roof needs replacing. Don't call me when you fall. I have Dorothy next door, I said. And I have Reverend Cass, and I have Richard Hale, and I have every resource a healthy, competent woman requires. I will be quite all right. Sharon touched Daniel's arm. This time he listened because he'd run out of room. They left without the flowers. Forgot them on the counter, or couldn't be bothered, or didn't want to make a gracious exit after an ugly ending. I stood on the porch and watched the car pull away, and I felt it. The fear. Not the cold, useful kind I'd been carrying for weeks. A sharper thing. The fear of a woman who has just watched her son look at her and mean something threatening. I stood with it for a minute, let it be real, and then I thought, good. Fear, when you don't run from it, becomes something else. It becomes certainty. It becomes the knowledge that what you're protecting is real and worth protecting. I went inside, picked up the phone, and called Richard. Thursday, I said. Make sure everyone is in place. Thursday came in quietly, the way important days often do. Gray sky, light wind, the maple tree outside just beginning to show the first yellow of early fall. Richard arrived at noon with his notary, a composed woman named Mrs. Brandt. Paulson arrived at 12:30, carrying a slim leather folder and a digital recorder she set on the bookshelf with my permission. And at 1:15, a woman named Carol Meehan from the Connecticut Department of Aging and Disability Services came to the door in a gray blazer with a state ID badge and a professional manner that put me immediately at ease. I had called the department 3 weeks ago, not to report, but to consult. Carol had become the person I consulted with. She had agreed to be present today, not as an investigator, but as an official witness. I set out coffee cups on the kitchen counter. I arranged chairs in the living room. I put on a cardigan and sat in Harold's armchair. At 2 o'clock, I heard a car in the driveway. Then another. Daniel knocked. He hadn't used his key. Interesting. When I opened the door, he was standing with Sharon, and behind them were 2 men I hadn't seen before. One was mid-40s, gray at the temples, wearing a sport coat. Gary Fitch, I presumed. The other was younger, in a dark tie, carrying a slim briefcase. Their attorney, or a representative of the LLC. Daniel's eyes swept the room before he'd stepped fully inside. He saw Richard, and something tightened around his mouth. He saw Paulson. He saw Carol Meehan's badge. Mom, he said carefully, what is this? Please come in, I said. Have a seat. Nobody sat. They stood in the living room in a loose, uncertain cluster, and I watched Gary Fitch, the developer, the man who built LLC shells around elderly people's homes, look around the room with the flat, assessing eyes of someone calculating exits. Richard spoke first. Thank you all for coming. I'm Richard Hale, Mrs. Collins's attorney of record. I want to make sure everyone is clear on the purpose of this meeting before we proceed. Mrs. Collins invited prospective buyers from Hartwell Property Holdings, LC, here today at their request, as she has every right to do. She has also invited several individuals to be present in a professional capacity, which she also has every right to do. This meeting is being recorded with the consent of all parties in this room. I didn't consent to any recording, Fitch said. Then you're welcome to leave, Richard said pleasantly. The meeting proceeds with or without you. Fitch looked at the younger man beside him. Something passed between them. Neither left. I'd like to start, I said, by asking a simple question. I looked at Gary Fitch directly. How many properties have you acquired through Hartwell Property Holdings LLC or through related entities in the past 5 years? He looked at me steadily. That's a matter of public record if you'd like to research it. I have researched it, I said. 7 properties in Connecticut and 1 in Rhode Island. 5 of those sellers were over the age of 70. 3 were widows. The average acquisition price was 22% below assessed market value. I looked at him calmly. I found that through the Connecticut property database and 3 conversations with Paulson, who is sitting to your left. Would you like to dispute any of those figures? Fitch said nothing. I turned to Daniel. And you, I said. Would you like to tell Mr. Fitch's attorney what your role in Hartwell's acquisition of this property was intended to be? Specifically, the finder's fee. Mom? Daniel's voice had gone very tight. This isn't the LLC operating agreement, Paulson said, speaking for the first time, lists Daniel Collins as a member with a 20% interest in the profit of this specific acquisition. That document was obtained through the Connecticut Secretary of State's Public Business Filing Database. Sharon made a sound, not quite a word, more like the sound of something being revised in real time. That doesn't accurately reflect, Daniel started. Daniel, the younger man in the dark tie said sharply. Daniel stopped, and that moment, when his own associate silenced him, was the first time I saw my son understand fully what he had walked into. Carol Meehan spoke quietly from her seat near the window. Mrs. Collins, for the record, can you confirm for me that you are here today voluntarily and of your own free will? I can, I said, and I am. And can you confirm that you have not agreed to the sale of this property? I have not agreed to the sale of this property, I said. The letter of intent I signed in my kitchen in June was signed without full understanding of its contents and under conditions of familial pressure. I am formally withdrawing that signature today in the presence of an attorney, a notary, and a representative of the state. Mrs. Brandt, the notary, was already ready. I signed the withdrawal document, calm and steady, as I always was, and she stamped it. The room was quiet. Fitch looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the floor. Sharon looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at me. I looked back at my son across the room that I had lived in for 41 years, and I said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said. The look was enough. We're done here, Fitch said finally, his voice controlled and cold. Yes, Richard said. You are. Mrs. Brandt will provide you with copies of today's documentation before you leave. If Hartwell Property Holdings LLC contacts Mrs. Collins again regarding this property, or if any person in this room attempts to initiate guardianship proceedings against her without legitimate grounds, we will be filing a complaint with the Connecticut Department of Consumer Protection and referring the matter to the State Attorney General's Elder Fraud Unit. That referral is already prepared. Fitch and his attorney left without another word. Daniel stood a moment longer. His face was very still. The face of a man standing in the aftermath of something he cannot undo. Sharon had her hand on his arm, but this time she wasn't guiding him. She was steadying herself. Daniel, I said. He looked at me. I love you, I said. That hasn't changed. But what you tried to do here was wrong, and you're going to have to live with that. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then they left. I sat for a long moment in Harold's armchair. Richard said something quiet and practical about next steps. Carol Meehan thanked me for my composure. Paulson closed her folder. Outside, the maple tree stood steady in the September wind, the same way it had stood for 48 years. Richard filed the formal complaint with the Connecticut Department of Consumer Protection that same evening. The referral to the Attorney General's Elder Fraud Unit went out on Friday. A packet that included the Hartwell LLC operating agreement, Paulson's research documenting the pattern of below-market acquisitions from elderly sellers, the recordings from my conversations with Daniel, and a statement from Carol Meehan, summarizing her observations at the Thursday meeting. I was not naive enough to expect immediate, dramatic results. Legal processes are slow, paperwork heavy, and deeply unglamorous. But I had learned from Harold, who had been a careful man, that the most durable outcomes are built quietly, one documented step at a time. The first concrete consequence came within 10 days. Richard received a letter from Hartwell Property Holdings, LLC's attorney, stating that his client was withdrawing from any interest in the property at 14 Birchwood Lane and formally releasing any claim arising from the letter of intent. The language was lawyerly and cold, and it arrived with the speed of a company that had calculated its exposure and decided retreat was preferable to litigation. Gary Fitch, I learned through Paulson, had also received a separate inquiry letter from the Consumer Protection Department. It was not a charge, not yet. It was the kind of letter that precedes a charge, a request for documentation, for records, for the operating agreements of related LLCs. The kind of letter that, when it arrives, tells a man that someone has been paying attention. Daniel's situation was more complicated because it was more personal. His employer, a regional insurance brokerage in Westport, became aware of the matter through means I did not orchestrate and did not need to. When a person's name appears in a state consumer protection inquiry related to financial fraud against an elderly family member, and that person works in financial services, the information moves. It moves because compliance departments exist and because insurance licensing boards take a professional interest in the conduct of their members. Daniel was placed on administrative leave in October, pending an internal review. I did not feel satisfaction about that. I want to be honest about that. It was a consequence I had known was possible, and I had not tried to prevent it, but it was not something I had aimed at with any pleasure. He was still my son. He had simply made choices with real-world outcomes, and the real world had declined to protect him from them. Sharon called me once, in late October. The warmth was gone from her voice entirely. What was there instead was something thinner and harder. Not anger, exactly. More like the sound of a person who has had to revise something they were very certain of. "I hope you're happy," she said. "I hope things improve for you," I said, and I meant it. She hung up. In November, Paulson told me, without my asking as she thought I should know, that Daniel and Sharon were in couples counseling. I didn't ask for details. The information arrived, and I set it down, the way you set down something you pick up and find heavier than you expected. The Attorney General's inquiry into Hartwell Property Holdings, LLC, continued. I was not a primary party. I was a witness, a complainant, a source of documentation. 3 other former property sellers, all elderly, were identified through Paulson's research and connected to the inquiry. 2 of them had signed full contracts and lost money. One case involved a woman in Bridgeport, 81 years old, who had received $110,000 less than her home was worth. I thought about her often. I thought about how many Margarets had sat at a kitchen table and signed something they didn't fully understand, because a person they trusted had put it in front of them. I had been lucky. Lucky in Harold, who had put the deed in both our names. Lucky in Richard, whose number I had kept in a drawer for 25 years. Lucky in Paulson, who was methodical and thorough. Lucky in Dorothy, who made tea and didn't offer advice. But it wasn't only luck. I had also refused to be afraid enough to stop thinking clearly. And that, I believe, made all the difference. In December, Richard sent me a letter. Clean, brief, professional. It confirmed that the property at 14 Birchwood Lane was free of any encumbrances, free of any pending claims, free of any legal complications arising from the events of the preceding 6 months. The house was mine, uncontested as it had been for 41 years. I folded the letter and put it in the kitchen drawer next to Harold's deed. Then I went out to the backyard and stood for a moment under the maple tree, bare now, in December, its branches open against the gray Connecticut sky. I pressed my hand against the bark the way Harold used to do on Sunday mornings, for no reason either of us could ever explain, except that the tree was old and steady, and it had been here when we arrived, and it would be here after us, and there was something comforting in that. I stood there for a while, in the cold quiet of my own yard. Then I went inside and made coffee. January came, and I decided to live differently, not dramatically. I was not a woman who reinvented herself at 74. But I had been deferring small choices as though waiting for permission from someone else. I understood now that I had been waiting for a life that was already mine. I had the guest room painted pale green, not because Harold would have chosen it, but because I liked it. I rejoined the church garden committee and argued pleasantly about heirloom tomatoes with women who were not trying to take anything from me. I drove to Boston to see my college friend Patricia, and on the train home I thought, I have been living too small. Richard told me in May that Hartwell had accepted a formal consent decree, restrictions, settlements, accountability. More than Fitch had planned on. Daniel called in August. He didn't quite apologize, but he reached out in the exhausted way of a man who has had a hard year and finds himself missing his mother. I was not ready to forgive, but I was willing to talk, carefully, with clear eyes. We had coffee on the porch in September. He looked older. For a little while it was almost ordinary. Sharon didn't come. I noticed and set it aside. The maple turned gold in October. Dorothy and I walked the neighborhood most mornings. Simple, dependable hours. I was 75 years old, living in my own house, with my name on the deed, in a room painted pale green. It was a very good life. So that is my story. I want you to take one thing from it. Your name on a document is the most powerful thing you own. Know what you're signing. Know what your rights are before you need them. And if someone who claims to love you is working harder to move you than to hear you, pay attention to that. It matters. Do not wait for crisis. Get your papers in order. Know your attorney's number. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story stayed with you, share it. Someone you know may need to hear it. Thank you for listening.